And welcome back. We are, of course, getting ready to dive into our next programming course. Now, this is going to be a little different than when we did this with Programming 2, because in our Programming 3 course, we are still going to look at some higher level concepts with Java, but we are also going to look at some other programming languages, because often if you go into the field for programming, you will find that you may not be working with Java. You may be working with a different programming language. So it is good for us to be able to look at some of that. But before we get to any of that, let's go ahead and first review some of our key concepts that we had in our previous course, starting with file input and output. So just as a review, when we are writing to a file, the key thing to remember is that we have to use the java.io library. And while we can import each individual class that we need and the appropriate exceptions, it is also acceptable that we can just use java.io to import the entire library that we need. Now, when we're writing into a file, we should include the code inside of a try-catch block, because remember, we have to make sure that, for example, if the file doesn't exist, we want to make sure we have the appropriate measures in place to make sure that that doesn't crash our program. And this could also happen, for example, when our program is, let's say, it encounters an error when trying to write to the file. All right, it's not going to immediately terminate our program because we have that try-catch block to handle those different situations. Now, this doesn't mean that our whole output stream is necessarily going to need to be in the try-catch block, but at least the portion that is accessing the file needs to be handled appropriately. Now, the way Java handles writing, of course, is with the printWriter class. PrintWriter does not actually print to the file itself, so we have to actually use the file output stream class when accessing the file. PrintWriter is just saying, hey, this is the thing I want to send, while file output stream is, again, remember, the thing that actually does the encoding all the different data to the file. Now, if we actually want to read a file in, the one way to do that is with the buffered reader class. And again, this is just using text files. So we could look at binary files as well, but today we're simply just going to kind of take this perspective of text files. And with these text files here, and using buffered reader, you got to remember that it's going to read that in as a file input. And we have different methods such as readLine, which is going to simply just read in the next line of text. And if there's nothing to read in, well, it's going to just return null if you don't have anything more in the file. Now, there's also the read method, of course, which simply just reads in a single character. And with read, remember, it will return -1 if there isn't another integer in the file, because remember, read is actually going to try to process as an int, and if you have a non-integer such as a double, you're going to actually need to typecast things, or if you have a single character. All right, so it has to be handled in the appropriate way, because readLine is more meant for strings, whereas read is more meant for like int. Now, buffered reader, of course, can use the file reader class to identify the file it will be parsing. So, of course, we want to make sure we have the correct file that we're reading in. But there is an easier way. If you recall, we can also use the scanner class, and scanner is a little bit more familiar to us, and so it's another approach that we can do if we're not familiar with using buffered reader. Now, because it is a little bit easier to use scanner because we are more familiar with some of the methods there. For example, we have next int, next double, those sort of things that we can use, and we don't have to necessarily worry about how read and readLine work from the other class. Now, many of the methods behave the same for files as they do for user input. So again, next int, next double, etc. A lot of those are going to behave the same. Now, we still need to use the file input stream, though, in order to identify the file that we're going to be scanning. Remember, we're not getting this from the console. We're not going to be typing things in there. Instead, we're reading it in from a file. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at those in Eclipse and get some examples here. So the first thing you'll notice is that we have, of course, our output stream here, and this is just a simple try-catch here. And of course, our try block is simply just making sure that this file is going to be able to be written. And of course, we have our catch block, which says, hey, I can't really open this file. That's no problem. Let's go ahead then and just do a simple prompt back to the user that says we're going to write to a file. And then, of course, we have several output stream messages here, which, of course, are simply just printing out some lines of text. Then, of course, and every time we're done with this, don't forget to close your output stream. If we don't close the output stream, we could encounter some weird errors here. So it's always a good idea when we're done with an output or an input stream that we close it off. Then, of course, we can simply just give a message saying it's the end of the program. And now we're going to switch to doing a reading in that file. So here we can see this is using buffered reader. And so we have the buffered reader, which is simply just going to read in the first line and the second line. And then, of course, we have the appropriate catch statements. This one's looking to see if the file was not found or cannot be opened. This is going to catch that. Whereas like this one is going to give us an error if it has an input-output error, so an IO exception here. So these are very essential whenever you're dealing with. You want to make sure you have these two catch statements here. Now, if we go a little further down, this is our scanner class, and you see it's almost identical to what we have here. However, a couple things you'll notice is that we have methods that are much more familiar to us. All right, because we are now using the scanner class now, we can then scan in with like next line, for example, instead of using our read line. Now, one thing you'll notice is I do have an IO exception here, and you notice it's saying, hey, this is unreachable catch block. All right, because they're handled by other catch blocks. That's because this catch block here, we can probably almost take out simply because this catch block is using the scanner class, and the scanner class has its own set of exceptions here. All right, it's not really going to hurt anything if I leave this in here. All right, because you notice it is just a warning. It says but it's unreachable, which means this would probably never be a situation that gets thrown. And again, this is simply because we're using the scanner class here rather than our buffered reader.